In a chance encounter, Richard Grant, a powerful CEO, finds his life forever changed when he crosses paths with Emily Hayes, a homeless woman struggling to survive. Their worlds collide in the unlikeliest of places, a train station, and neither of them could predict where this fate would lead. Before we dive into today's story, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an amazing story. And if you're already part of the family, thank you for being here. Let's get started with today's incredible journey. Richard Grant was the embodiment of success. As CEO of one of the most powerful corporations in the world, he had everything a man could dream of: wealth, status, and influence. His life was a whirlwind of business meetings, luxurious events, and endless power plays. Yet beneath the surface of his carefully curated world, there was a gnawing emptiness, a loneliness that clung to him no matter how many people surrounded him. His life, for all its grandeur, felt hollow, as if something crucial was missing, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. Meanwhile, Emily Hayes' world was starkly different. A woman in her mid-20s, abandoned by her family and left to navigate the harsh streets, Emily's life was a daily struggle for survival. Her once vibrant smile had faded into a mask of exhaustion, her eyes reflecting the weight of the hardships she had endured. Homeless and forced to sleep at a train station, she had grown accustomed to the stares, the judgment, and the cold, impersonal world that ignored her existence. Yet despite the overwhelming challenges, there was an undeniable spark within her, a strength she clung to, refusing to let despair define her. One cold evening, fate brought these two contrasting lives together at the most unlikely of places, the train station. Richard, passing through on a business trip, caught sight of Emily, sleeping on the cold concrete bench. His eyes lingered on her, drawn to her vulnerability, yet something deeper stirred within him. That brief moment, which could have been forgotten like so many others, would alter the course of both their lives. Little did they know that encounter was only the beginning of an unexpected journey that would change them forever. Richard's train had been delayed, and he found himself wandering through the dimly lit train station, passing time while he waited. His mind was on the next meeting he had to attend, yet something seemed off. The hustle and bustle of the station felt unusually muted tonight. As he walked, his gaze fell upon a figure hunched on a bench in the corner of the waiting area. It was a woman, curled up in tattered clothes, wrapped in what appeared to be a thin, worn blanket. She was no different from the many others who lived in the shadows of the city, invisible to the passers-by who refused to acknowledge them. Yet for some inexplicable reason, Richard couldn't look away. There was something about her that caught his attention, something that pulled at his conscience. He tried to shake off the thought, focusing on his phone to distract himself, but his eyes kept drifting back to the woman. He had seen the poor and homeless before. He'd seen it all: charity events, fundraisers, and countless photos of street dwellers plastered on the media. But this woman, she was different. The way she sat, so small and fragile, yet carrying an air of quiet dignity, unsettled him. As he continued walking past, a sudden commotion broke the silence. A group of loud men, intoxicated and rowdy, approached the woman. Richard could see them taunting her, laughing at her misfortune, and before he could stop himself, he found his legs moving toward them. His sharp voice cut through the noise. "Hey, leave her alone!" The men turned toward him, their sneers transforming into aggression as they saw Richard, dressed in his expensive suit, intruding on their territory. "What's it to you, rich boy?" one of them slurred. Richard felt his heart race, but he stood his ground, his voice steady as he warned them again. "I said, leave her alone." The men hesitated for a moment, but sensing Richard's unyielding stance, they grumbled and retreated. Richard watched them disappear into the crowd, his pulse still quickened. He turned to the woman, expecting to see gratitude or relief in her eyes. Instead, she just looked at him, her expression unreadable, a faint trace of wariness in her gaze. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. Richard was caught off guard by the question. He hesitated before answering, unsure of how to explain it. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing." She gave a small nod as if accepting his answer, but her guarded expression remained. There was silence between them for a few moments before Richard spoke again. "Are you okay?" The woman glanced at him, and for a brief second, Richard saw something more than just weariness in her eyes. There was pain, an almost heartbreaking depth to it. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold mask of indifference. "I'm fine," she muttered. "Thank you." Richard felt a strange mix of emotions. He knew he had to leave, yet he didn't want to. Something in him urged him to stay, to learn more about this woman, this stranger whose life seemed so far removed from his own. But with a final glance at her, he turned and walked away, the image of her lingering in his mind long after he left the station. The days that followed that brief encounter lingered in Richard's mind, an unfamiliar weight he couldn't shake off. He threw himself back into his work, but something kept pulling his thoughts toward the woman at the station. He found himself replaying the moment over and over, her guarded eyes, the vulnerability in her posture, and the way her voice had cracked when she spoke. Why had he helped her? It was a simple act, one that anyone could have done. Yet Richard couldn't help but feel that it meant something deeper, something that had stirred him in a way nothing had in years. He had everything he could ever want: wealth, status, a successful career. But the loneliness he had ignored for so long began to feel suffocating. That night, after another lavish dinner with his colleagues, Richard sat in his penthouse apartment, the towering skyline of the city stretched before him. He poured himself a drink, his fingers tracing the rim of the glass, lost in thought. He had everything, and yet nothing. He couldn't stop thinking about her, Emily. That was the name he remembered from the brief exchange they'd had. Emily Hayes. The name felt strangely important, as though he were meant to know it, and yet here she was, lost in the shadows of a city that seemed so far removed from his world. He had to know more. He couldn't stop himself from searching for her. It started with a casual inquiry to the station's security team. Richard wasn't used to feeling this kind of curiosity, but he was determined to find out more about her. They confirmed that she had been a regular sight at the station, often seen in the same spot, waiting for trains she would never board. He asked if they knew anything about her, her past, her story, but the response was always the same. She was just another homeless woman drifting through the city unnoticed. His search continued, though he couldn't explain why. Emily's presence, or rather her absence, gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into the unknown. Eventually, after weeks of fruitless searching, Richard hired a private investigator. He knew it was an extreme step, but something inside him told him that Emily wasn't just another face in the crowd. The investigator returned with information, details about her tragic life. Emily had grown up in a small town, raised by a mother who struggled with addiction and a father who abandoned them when Emily was just a child. After her mother's death, Emily found herself on the streets at the age of 17, forced to fend for herself in an unforgiving world. The investigation revealed a string of failed jobs, lost opportunities, and a series of relationships that ended in betrayal and abuse. Emily's life had been a series of misfortunes, one after another. But despite the odds, she had survived. Richard felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and sorrow as he read through the report. He had imagined her life as a series of poor choices, but the truth was much darker. She wasn't a victim of her own making. She was a victim of circumstances, a world that had turned its back on her at every turn. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, his mind racing. His wealth, his power, it meant nothing in the face of Emily's reality. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every situation, but here he was, completely powerless. He could help her, but he didn't know how. He didn't know what she wanted or what she needed, and that terrified him. Richard found himself at a crossroads. He could continue his life as it was, empty, controlled, and predictable, or he could step into the unknown, face his fears, and find Emily. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, after hours of contemplation, Richard made a decision. He would find her, offer her help, and try to make a difference in her life. But it wasn't going to be easy. He knew she wouldn't accept charity, not from someone like him. She was proud, too proud to let anyone feel sorry for her. But that didn't matter. He had to try. He had to know that he did everything he could to change her life, even if she didn't want him to. Richard's resolve didn't waver, even though the journey ahead seemed daunting. He was determined to find Emily, to offer her the help she needed, even if she rejected it. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had to make a difference in her life, even if it meant stepping out of his comfort zone. He had Emily's name and a few scattered details about her life, but the most difficult part of the search had just begun. He knew that finding her again wouldn't be as easy as tracking down a lost item or a misplaced contact. He began by visiting the train station every day, hoping to find her sitting there, waiting for something, anything to come her way. But for days, she was nowhere to be found. He spent hours walking the streets near the station, speaking with homeless people and asking questions about a young woman who had been living there. He even tried contacting local shelters and outreach programs, but Emily's name never turned up. It seemed like she had vanished from the world, just another nameless face lost in the sea of poverty and misfortune. The frustration was beginning to take a toll on him. Richard wasn't used to not having control over a situation. He had spent years building an empire, taking charge, making things happen. But this felt different. This felt personal. His own resources, his money, his status, it meant nothing in the face of Emily's struggles. He was realizing just how much he had taken for granted, how blind he had been to the world outside of his wealth and privilege. It wasn't until a week later, when Richard was almost ready to give up, that he received a tip from an unlikely source. A local shopkeeper recognized Emily from a photo Richard had shown him. She wasn't in the station anymore, but she had been seen around a small cafe near the outskirts of the city. Richard's heart leapt. This was the break he had been waiting for. Without hesitation, he followed the lead, driving to the cafe the next morning. When he arrived, he could see Emily through the window, sitting alone at a small table near the back. She was looking out the window, her face unreadable, lost in thought. She hadn't noticed him yet, and for a moment, Richard stood frozen, observing her. She looked different now, cleaner, more put together, but there was still a sadness in her eyes that tugged at his heart. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing softly. Emily's head snapped up at the sound, and for a moment their eyes locked. She froze, her expression turning wary as she recognized him. Richard could see the guarded look in her eyes, the instinctive defense she put up as she quickly stood to leave, but Richard wasn't going to let her go this time. "Emily," he said softly, walking toward her. "Wait." She stopped in her tracks but didn't turn to face him. "What do you want, Mr. Grant?" she asked, her voice cold and distant, a clear reminder of the gap between them. "I don't need your help." Richard was taken aback by her bluntness, but he had expected this. He had been prepared for it. "I'm not here to offer charity," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "I just want to help. You don't have to accept it, but I can't stop thinking about you, about what you've been through. If you'd just let me, I'd like to give you a chance, a real chance." Emily's eyes flickered with something, uncertainty, confusion, or maybe a glimmer of hope. She didn't speak at first, her arms crossed defensively. Richard could see the struggle in her, the inner conflict between wanting to protect her pride and the desperate need for something better. "I don't want to owe anyone anything," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly, betraying her attempt to remain strong. "I don't want you to owe me anything," Richard replied. "I just want to make sure you have what you deserve, a chance to start over. No strings attached, no expectations. Just a fresh start." There was a long silence as Emily considered his words, her eyes flickering to the ground, lost in thought. She was torn between rejecting him out of pride and accepting his offer out of necessity. Richard didn't push her further. He knew this wasn't something that could be forced. All he could do was offer her the opportunity, and the decision would ultimately be hers. Finally, Emily let out a deep breath and met his gaze once more. "I don't know if I can trust you," she whispered, her voice filled with vulnerability. "I understand," Richard said softly, "and I'm not asking you to trust me right now, but you don't have to face this alone. You don't have to go through it by yourself." For the first time since their encounter, Emily's guard seemed to lower just a fraction. She stood there, contemplating his offer, her mind clearly at war with itself. Richard could see the walls she had built around herself, walls that had been erected for years as a defense mechanism against the world. And he knew that it would take more than a simple offer of help to tear them down. "I'll help you find a place to stay," Richard continued, "and if you want, I can connect you with resources, jobs, training, whatever you need. But you're in control. You decide what happens next." Emily looked at him for a long moment, weighing his words, before finally nodding. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'll take your help, but I don't want pity." "I don't pity you," Richard assured her. "I just want to give you the opportunity you deserve." Over the following weeks, Richard kept his promise. He found Emily a small apartment in a quiet part of the city, far from the noise and chaos of the train station. The place was modest, but it was hers, clean, safe, and far removed from the harsh realities of the streets she had once called home. Richard arranged for a few essentials, furniture, clothing, and food, and made sure she had everything she needed to start over. At first, Emily was reluctant to accept the help. She was fiercely independent, and the idea of relying on anyone, let alone someone from such a different world, made her uncomfortable. But Richard had made it clear that this wasn't charity. She could come and go as she pleased, and there were no strings attached. That, at least, was something she could live with. In the mornings, Richard would check in with her, making sure everything was going smoothly. He'd send her messages or call, offering to help in any way he could, but never pushing her. It took some time, but gradually, Emily began to accept his help. She started looking for work, something that she hadn't been able to do in years. The freedom she had now was both exhilarating and terrifying. For the first time, she felt like she had a choice in what happened next, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. She had spent so long simply surviving that the idea of thriving was almost alien to her. But with each interview she went to, with each small step she took toward rebuilding her life, Emily started to feel a spark of hope. One afternoon, Richard invited her to lunch at a cafe near his office. It was a casual invitation, nothing formal or businesslike, but Emily hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that, ready to step into his world of wealth, suits, and perfect smiles. But she agreed, knowing it would be a step forward. The lunch was awkward at first. Emily felt out of place in the upscale cafe, the polished silverware and crisp white napkins making her feel like an outsider. Richard, however, was kind and patient, making sure to keep the conversation light and easy. They talked about simple things, movies, books, the weather, but there was an unspoken connection between them, something deeper than the surface-level conversation. Over time, their bond grew. They spent more time together, not just in business meetings or moments of necessity, but in shared moments of vulnerability. Richard began to open up about his own life, his past, and his feelings of loneliness. He admitted that despite his success, he had always felt isolated, disconnected from the people around him, his family, his colleagues, his friends. They all saw him as the successful businessman, the CEO with the world at his feet, but no one saw the man behind the facade. Emily, in turn, began to trust him more. She told him about her childhood, her mother's addiction, and the pain of losing her family. She spoke of the nights she spent alone on the streets, how she had learned to rely only on herself, how she had shut off her emotions to survive. She admitted that she had always kept people at a distance because it was easier than letting them in, easier than risking the hurt that came with abandonment. The more they shared with each other, the more they realized how similar they were. Both had been hurt by the people who were supposed to love them. Both had built walls around themselves to protect their hearts. Yet, with each passing day, the walls between them began to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of understanding and mutual respect. But as their friendship deepened, so did the feelings they had for each other. At first, Richard tried to ignore it. He told himself that he was just helping her, that their connection was born out of compassion. He convinced himself that Emily was a project, someone to help, someone to fix. But it wasn't long before he realized that his feelings for her were far more complicated than that. He found himself thinking about her constantly, wondering what she was doing, what she was feeling, how she was adjusting to her new life. He caught himself smiling at the thought of her, a warmth spreading through him whenever she crossed his mind. Richard had never been one to indulge in emotions, but Emily had a way of making him feel things he had long buried, things he hadn't felt in years. Emily, too, began to feel the pull between them. At first, she thought it was just gratitude, but as the days went on, she realized that she cared for him in a way she hadn't anticipated. She admired his strength, his kindness, and the way he seemed to genuinely care about her. But she also struggled with the vast differences between them. He was a CEO, wealthy and powerful, and she was just a woman who had survived the streets. The disparity between them felt like an insurmountable wall, one that neither of them knew how to overcome. Emily wondered if Richard saw her as nothing more than a project, a person to save. And Richard, despite his growing affection for her, couldn't shake the fear that she might only see him as a means to an end, someone with the power to change her circumstances, but not her heart. One evening, as they sat together in her apartment, sipping tea and talking about nothing in particular, the air between them shifted. There was a moment of silence, a quiet tension that neither of them knew how to break. Richard looked at her, his gaze lingering on her face as if searching for something. Emily met his eyes, and for a brief moment, they both understood. The unspoken feelings they had for each other were undeniable. Richard reached out, his hand brushing hers gently. The touch was electric, sending a rush of warmth through both of them. Emily's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her lips parting as if to speak, but the words never came. In that moment, the world seemed to disappear. There was only Richard, and there was only Emily. Their differences, their fears, their doubts, they all faded into the background, replaced by something far stronger. A connection neither of them had expected, but both of them had come to desperately need. In the weeks that followed, their connection deepened. Richard and Emily spent more time together, each meeting slowly dissolving the barriers that had once kept them apart. What began as an act of compassion from Richard had turned into something more, something neither of them could deny. They had crossed the line from simple friendship to something far more complicated. The tension between them was palpable. Richard found himself constantly thinking about Emily, his mind wandering to her every time he was alone. He noticed the way her smile lit up a room, the way her eyes softened when she talked about her past, and the way she seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders, even when she was smiling. He admired her strength, her resilience, and the way she had refused to let the harshness of life break her. There was something magnetic about her, a raw honesty that made him feel vulnerable, something he had never allowed himself to experience before. For Emily, the growing attraction was equally undeniable. Richard's kindness and patience had allowed her to see him in a way no one had ever seen her, beyond the rough exterior she had built to protect herself. He saw her as more than a victim of her circumstances. He saw her as an equal, as someone who had value beyond her past. As they spent more time together, Emily realized that she was falling for him, not just because of what he could offer her, but because of who he was. However, their growing feelings for each other came with complications. Emily struggled with the idea of being in a relationship with someone like Richard. She had spent so long on her own, fiercely independent, that the idea of depending on anyone felt foreign. But it wasn't just her independence that held her back. There was a part of her that feared she wasn't good enough for him. Richard had everything: wealth, status, and a future that seemed so far removed from the life she had once known. For Richard, the fear was more internal. He wondered if Emily was only interested in him because of what he could provide her. It was a fear he couldn't shake, despite how genuine their connection seemed. His wealth, his success, it all made him question whether she could ever truly see him for who he was, beyond the title of CEO. He was used to being admired for his power, but this was different. It made him question the authenticity of his own feelings and whether Emily could truly love him for who he was, not just for what he could do for her. One evening, as they sat together in Richard's office after work, the tension reached its peak. Emily had been quieter than usual, her mind clearly occupied with something. Richard couldn't ignore it any longer. He put down his papers and turned to her. "Emily," he said softly, his voice filled with concern. "What's going on? You've been distant lately. Talk to me." She hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this, Richard. I don't know if I can be with you. You're everything I've never been, everything I've never had. I'm scared. I'm scared that I'm not good enough for you, that I'm just a project to you, something for you to fix." Richard's heart clenched. He had known she was struggling with this, but hearing her say it out loud hit him harder than he expected. He reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You're not a project. You're not something I want to fix. I don't want to change you, I just want to be with you. You're more than enough for me. I've never felt this way about anyone, and it's not about what you have or don't have. It's about who you are. You're strong, beautiful, and real in a way that no one else is." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she looked at him, her chest tight with emotion. "But what if I'm not enough for you? What if I don't belong in your world?" she asked, her voice trembling. Richard squeezed her hand, his gaze never leaving hers. "Emily, the world I live in doesn't matter. It's not about the money or the power. It's about us. We don't need anything else but what we have together. I don't care about your past or your struggles. What matters is right now, and right now, I want to be with you. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in weeks, Emily allowed herself to believe him. She looked into his eyes and saw the sincerity, the vulnerability, and the deep affection that had always been there, even when she had been too afraid to recognize it. "I'm scared, Richard," she whispered. "I don't know how to do this." "I'll be right here," he said softly, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "You don't have to do it alone." In that moment, the fear that had held them both back began to fade. They were still unsure of the future, still unsure of what lay ahead, but they had each other. And for the first time, both of them allowed themselves to embrace the possibility of a future together. Their romance grew from there, unfolding slowly and tenderly, each step a confirmation of the love they shared. Emily's walls continued to come down, and Richard found himself learning to let go of the control that had defined so much of his life. They were two people from different worlds, but in each other they had found something far more valuable than wealth, status, or security: love, trust, and an undeniable bond that nothing could break. Just when things began to feel like they were finally falling into place, life threw a series of challenges their way, testing both Emily and Richard in ways they hadn't anticipated. It started with Richard's family. For years, his relationship with them had been strained. His parents, particularly his father, had always had certain expectations for him, expectations that didn't include a woman like Emily. Richard had never introduced anyone to his family before, not since his late fiancée, whose sudden death had pushed him deeper into his isolated world. But Emily was different. He wanted her by his side, wanted to introduce her as someone important in his life. So, one evening, he invited his parents over for dinner, hoping that they would see what he saw in Emily. When they arrived at his apartment, Richard could feel the tension in the air. His mother's stiff smile and his father's disapproving gaze were hard to ignore. They exchanged pleasantries, but the unspoken judgment was palpable. Emily, ever aware of the social gap between them, seemed to shrink back, her shoulders tense as she struggled to keep her composure. As dinner progressed, Richard's father finally broke the silence. "Richard, we've been speaking about your future," he began, his tone cool and calculated. "You're CEO of a major company. You need someone who can keep up with your world, someone who understands the responsibilities of your position." Richard's heart sank. He knew where this was going, but he couldn't bring himself to stop it. "I understand, Father," he replied, his voice tight. "But Emily is important to me, and she's more than capable of understanding what I do." His father's face hardened. "I don't think she's what you need. She's not from our world, Richard. She's different. You deserve someone who can stand by you, someone who's a reflection of your success." Richard felt a surge of anger. His father's words were a slap in the face, but even worse was the fact that Emily was hearing it all. Her face reddened, and she quietly excused herself, stepping out onto the balcony. Richard's father didn't seem to notice the damage he had done. He continued talking about business, oblivious to the tension that had taken hold of the room. Richard's gaze followed Emily outside, his heart heavy with guilt. Once they were alone, he rushed to the balcony, finding her standing at the railing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The cool evening air seemed to match the chill between them. "Emily," Richard began, but she interrupted him before he could finish. "You didn't need to do that," she said quietly, her voice tinged with hurt. "You didn't need to introduce me to them. I knew it was going to be like this." Richard stepped closer, reaching out for her hand, but she pulled away, turning her face toward the skyline. "I don't belong in that world, Richard," she continued, her voice strained. "And I'm not sure I ever will. I'm just a reminder of everything that's wrong in your life, aren't I?" "Stop," Richard said, his voice breaking. "You're not a reminder of anything wrong. You're everything that's right. My father doesn't know you. He doesn't know what we've built together. Don't let his words make you doubt that." But Emily shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can be what you need. I'm just a woman who has nothing."
"And you have everything." "Emily, please don't say that. You are more than enough for me," Richard said, his voice pleading. "Don't listen to them." But the damage had already been done. The seed of doubt had been planted in Emily's mind, and despite Richard's assurances, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was always going to be out of place in his world. As if that wasn't enough, Emily's past began to resurface, pulling her back into the world she had tried so hard to escape. One afternoon, as she was coming home from an interview, she was confronted by a man she hadn't seen in years, Jack, her abusive ex-boyfriend. He was standing on the street corner, his eyes cold and calculating as they met hers. His presence immediately sent a wave of panic through her. "Emily," he sneered, taking a step toward her. "You thought you could run away from me? You thought you could escape your past?" Emily took a step back, her heart racing. She hadn't seen Jack since she had left him, and she had worked hard to bury that part of her life. But here he was, ready to drag her back into the mess she had escaped from. He had always been controlling, manipulative, and cruel, and she had no idea what he wanted now. "I'm not going back to you, Jack," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm not the same person I was." Jack smirked. "We'll see about that. I know where you live now, and I'll be seeing you soon. Don't think you're safe." As he turned to leave, Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't let Richard know about this. She didn't want to drag him into her past, didn't want to risk him seeing her as weak. But she couldn't ignore the fear that gripped her heart. What would Jack do if he found her again? Would he threaten her life like he had before? Emily felt completely torn. She couldn't go back to living in fear, but she also couldn't bear the thought of bringing Richard into her dangerous past. She knew she had to face it on her own, but the weight of it was crushing. Richard, unaware of the storm that was brewing, continued to worry about Emily's distance. He couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. She had pulled away from him, emotionally, and the tension between them was growing. He needed to know what was going on, but every time he tried to ask, Emily shut him out. It wasn't long before Richard received a phone call that would change everything. A private investigator he had hired to look into Emily's past had called him with troubling news. Jack was back, and he was dangerous. Richard knew then that he couldn't stand by and watch Emily suffer. He had to act. But as Richard prepared to confront the threat looming over Emily, the one thing that had held them together, their love, was now being tested by forces neither of them had anticipated. The tension between Richard and Emily reached a breaking point as everything they had built together seemed to be unraveling. The combination of Richard's family's disapproval and the resurfacing of Emily's past threatened to destroy the fragile trust they had worked so hard to establish. Emily was no longer the confident woman she had become. She was once again retreating into the walls she had built to protect herself. Walls that Richard couldn't break through no matter how hard he tried. Richard knew that he couldn't sit back and let her slip away. He had to act, not just for her, but for their future. The phone call from the private investigator had shaken him to his core. Jack wasn't just a ghost from Emily's past, he was a threat to her safety, and Richard wasn't going to allow anyone to hurt the woman he loved. That evening, after Emily had left for the night, Richard sat in his office, making phone calls to security teams, lawyers, and anyone who could help him find Jack and keep Emily safe. He knew he couldn't let Emily fight this battle alone, even if she thought she had to. She had been hurt before, but he wasn't going to allow her to be hurt again, not on his watch. Emily, meanwhile, was struggling with her own demons. She had tried to push Richard away to protect him, but deep down, she knew she couldn't hide forever. Jack's reappearance had shaken her, but what scared her even more was the idea of losing Richard. She had never felt loved in the way Richard loved her, and she was terrified that she didn't deserve it. Her past, the things she had done to survive, seemed like insurmountable barriers that kept her from being good enough for him. As she walked through the quiet streets on her way home, her mind racing with thoughts of Jack and the mounting pressure from every direction, Emily's phone buzzed. It was a message from Richard. "Meet me at the cafe where we first talked. I need to see you." Her heart skipped a beat. She knew something had changed in Richard. Something had shifted in the way he was dealing with everything. She had been avoiding him for days, but the message made her stop in her tracks.
She needed to face this, once and for all. She couldn't run from the truth any longer. Not from herself, not from Richard. When Emily arrived at the cafe, she saw Richard sitting at their usual spot, his face a mix of determination and concern. The moment their eyes met, she felt a flood of emotion, fear, love, uncertainty, all crashing down on her at once. "Emily," Richard said softly, standing up as she approached. "You've been pulling away from me, and I can't stand to see you hurting. I know about Jack, and I know you think you need to handle this on your own, but you don't have to. I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she stood there, speechless. "I don't want you to be involved in this. You've done so much already. I don't want to drag you down." Richard reached out, taking her hands in his grip firm and reassuring. "Emily, listen to me. You don't get to decide what I can or can't handle. I love you. I don't care about your past, and I don't care what happened before. I'm here for you. And together, we'll face whatever comes next." Emily shook her head, still unsure. "But what if I can't be what you want? What if I'm always going to be too broken for someone like you?" Richard cupped her face gently in his hands, forcing her to look into his eyes. "You're not broken, Emily. You're everything I've been looking for, even when I didn't know it. your strength, your kindness. It's what makes you beautiful. I don't care about what you've been through. I care about who you are now, and I'm not going anywhere." Her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe him. The walls she had spent so long building started to crumble, piece by piece, as she let herself be vulnerable with him. The fear she had carried so long began to dissipate in the warmth of his words. "I'm scared," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "But I want to try. I want to be with you." Richard smiled, his heart swelling with relief. "We'll do this together. Whatever happens, we face it together." Just then a figure appeared in the doorway of the cafe. It was Jack. He stood there, his eyes cold and calculating, his stance aggressive as he glared at them. He had followed Emily, and he wasn't going to let her go without a fight. Richard's protective instinct kicked in immediately. He stood up, placing himself between Emily and Jack, his body tense with anger. "Stay away from her," Richard said in a low, warning tone. Jack sneered. "You think she's yours, huh? She'll always be mine whether she likes it or not." Emily felt the familiar rush of fear flood her chest, but this time it wasn't the same. Richard was here, standing between her and the man who had tormented her. She wasn't alone anymore. "You don't control me, Jack," Emily said, her voice steady and stronger than it had ever been before. "I'm not going back to you. I'm not your property." Jack's face contorted with rage, and before he could say another word, Richard moved quickly, standing tall and firm. "I'm calling the police. Leave now, or I'll have you arrested for harassment." The tension in the air was palpable as Jack hesitated for a moment. His gaze flickered between Richard and Emily, but seeing the resolve in both of their eyes, he finally sneered and turned to leave. "This isn't over," he muttered, disappearing into the night. As the door closed behind him, Emily let out a shaky breath, her body still tense from the confrontation. Richard turned to her, his hand reaching for hers. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft but determined. "No one will hurt you again." In that moment, Emily realized that she wasn't just safe from Jack, she was safe from her own fears too. She had someone who loved her, who would protect her, no matter what. And together they would face whatever challenges life threw their way. As they walked out of the cafe together, hand in hand, Emily finally allowed herself to believe in their future. Whatever came next, they would face it together, with love, strength, and the unwavering bond they had forged. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change, but for the first time in a long time, Emily felt a sense of peace that she had never known before. Jack's threat had been neutralized, and though the fear still lingered in the back of her mind, the support Richard had shown her gave her the strength to believe that she could truly move forward. With Richard's help, she began to rebuild her life. She started a new job at a small but promising company, one that allowed her to use her skills and talents. The work was challenging but rewarding, and for the first time, she felt like she was building something for herself, not relying on anyone else but finding her own strength and purpose. Richard too had changed. His relationship with his family had not improved overnight, but he no longer cared as much about their approval. He had made it clear to them that he wasn't going to live his life according to their expectations. His love for Emily had forced him to reevaluate his priorities, and he knew that nothing in his life mattered more than her. One evening, several months after their confrontation with Jack, Richard took Emily out to a quiet, intimate dinner at a small restaurant by the water. The evening was perfect. The warm glow of the sunset reflected off the water, and the soft sounds of nature surrounded them as they sat at their table, enjoying each other's company. Richard reached across the table, his fingers gently brushing against hers. Emily, he said softly, his eyes sincere. I know we've had our share of struggles, but I wouldn't trade a single moment of it. You've made me see what really matters in life. You've shown me what love is. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she looked at him, her heart swelling with emotion. She had come so far from the woman who had slept at the train station, the woman who thought she was unworthy of love. And now, here she was, strong, loved, and ready to embrace a future she had once believed was impossible. I love you, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. I never thought I would feel this way again. But with you, I know I'm home. You've given me everything I never thought I deserved. Richard smiled, his heart full. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Emily's breath caught in her throat as he opened it, revealing a beautiful engagement ring. Emily, he said, his voice filled with love and certainty. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? A wave of joy and disbelief washed over her. This was the man who had saved her from the darkness, who had shown her what real love and security felt like. And now he was asking her to be with him forever. Yes, she whispered, her voice shaking with happiness. Yes, I will. Richard slipped the ring onto her finger, and in that moment Emily knew that she was no longer just a survivor of her past. She was a woman who had been loved unconditionally, who had found her place in a world that had once seemed so cold and distant. And with Richard by her side, she had everything she needed to build a future of hope, love, and happiness. As they left the restaurant that night, hand in hand, the city lights twinkling around them, Emily looked up at Richard, her heart full. They had overcome so much, but their journey together was just beginning. She knew that no matter what challenges they would face in the future, they would always face them together, stronger, united, and filled with a love that had conquered all. They walked into their future, ready to embrace everything that awaited them. A year had passed since Richard had proposed to Emily, and their lives had blossomed into something they had both once thought impossible. Emily had grown into a confident, self-assured woman, flourishing in both her personal and professional life. Her past no longer defined her. It was simply a chapter that had led her to where she was now. Richard had fully embraced the changes that Emily had brought into his life. He had stepped away from the relentless drive for business success, instead focusing on what truly mattered: his relationship with Emily, his own growth, and the love they shared. He had reconciled with his family to some degree, but he no longer sought their approval. Emily had taught him that he was enough, just as he was, and that no external validation could replace the peace he felt when he was with her. Their wedding day arrived, and it was a small, intimate ceremony, nothing extravagant, just the people who truly mattered. It was held in a quiet garden, surrounded by nature's beauty, with the soft sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves filling the air. Emily wore a simple but elegant dress, and Richard, dressed in a tailored suit, looked at her with the same love and admiration he had felt the first time they met. As they exchanged vows, Emily's heart swelled with a joy she had never known. The fear, the doubt, and the insecurities of her past had all melted away, replaced by the certainty of the life they would build together. She no longer saw herself as a broken woman. She saw herself as an equal, loved and cherished by the man who had shown her the true meaning of love. Together they began a new chapter, one that would be filled with laughter, growth, and an unshakable bond that nothing could break. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more heartwarming tales filled with love, suspense, and emotional twists, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update on our latest videos. Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Do you think Emily and Richard's love story was destined? Let us know how you feel about their journey and stay tuned for more amazing content.